Each year, millions of children are victimized or exposed to violence in their homes, in their schools, and in their communities. And if these traumatic experiences are not addressed, they can lead to a whole host of negative consequences, like mental health and substance use disorders, problems in school, excessive risk-taking, delinquent behavior, and ultimately involvement in the juvenile justice system. And we know this to be true because anywhere from 75 to 90% of youth in the justice system have experienced trauma. In most of these children that have experienced traumatic events within the justice system, most of them have experienced multiple events. So the juvenile justice system is now well poised to play a real important role in improving outcomes for these youth by a number of things, a number of strategies that they can employ, by helping staff better understand how exposure to violence impacts the lives of these youth, how exposure to violence can impact youth behavior, for systems to develop policies and procedures within their system that reflect this understanding and this new knowledge around the impact of violence, and finally by implementing or linking to treatment interventions that address traumatic stress. So today's webinar is focused on ways that the juvenile justice system can become more trauma-informed and to discuss and identify what the essential elements are for creating a trauma-informed system, such as the use of evidence-based practices for screening and responding to youth who are in need of trauma-informed services or care, opportunities to create a more trauma-informed juvenile justice workforce, and mechanisms for integrating a trauma-informed model into standard juvenile justice policy and practice. So now I would like to take a moment to introduce our esteemed panel. Our first presenter is Dr. Julian Ford, who is a clinical psychologist and associate professor of psychiatry at the University of Connecticut Health Center. He developed and conducts research on the Trauma Adaptive Recovery Group Education and Therapy Model, also known as TARGET, for adolescents victimized by violence in the child welfare and juvenile justice systems. And he is co-developer of the Traumatic Screening Events Instrument, also known as TESI. Dr. Ford serves as a senior academic fellow with the Child Health and Development Institute and has led a series of policy studies concerning mental health and traumatic stress services for youth in the juvenile justice system. He serves as the Director of Research and Assessment for the Yale University of Connecticut Center for Children Exposed to Violence within the SAMHSA'S Child Traumatic Stress Network. Dr. Ford will be followed by Dr. Keith Cruz, who is an associate professor and co-director of the Clinical Specialization in Forensics in the Department of Psychology at Fordham University in New York City. Dr. Cruz conducts research on the clinical forensic assessment of youth within the juvenile justice system, and his projects have included development and validation of specialized risk assessment protocols, investigating the utility of mental health screening instruments with justice-involved youth, and understanding the connection between trauma exposure and delinquent behavior. Dr. Cruz's clinical forensic practice is involved providing direct care assessment and treatment services within justice-involved youth, conducting post-dispositional assessments of risk and treatment amenability, providing expert testimony to juvenile courts, and developing treatment protocols for this population. And our third presenter is Dr. Chris Branson, who is a child psychologist with the Center for Child Trauma and Resilience at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine, also in New York City. He has significant clinical and research experience with youth involved in the juvenile justice system and serves as co-chair of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network's Juvenile Justice Committee. Dr. Branson also currently provides technical assistance and consultation to juvenile justice agencies in New York City, Philadelphia, and Florida on the adoption of trauma-informed practice. So with that, I am ready to hand the mic, if you will, over to our first presenter, Dr. Julian Ford.
Thank you, Kathy, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone. We have a challenging set of issues to talk about. Becoming trauma-informed sounds like a great idea, but it's much harder than it looks, and we're going to try to give you some perspective on that. Probably many of you are working on projects right now that are intended to and are actually helping juvenile justice programs and programs working with them in the mental health and child welfare systems and in the schools and in pediatrics and in social services, all working together to try to find ways to help youth, children and youth who've been traumatized to actually recover. So we know, as Kathy said, the estimates of the proportion of youth involved in juvenile justice who have experienced at least one traumatic stressor, and usually multiple, range from 60 to 90%, and it tends to more typically be toward the high end. So virtually every boy or girl, young man or young woman who becomes involved in the juvenile justice system has experienced some potential threat to their life, to the life of someone whom they depend upon or know and care about, or has experienced a violation of their bodily integrity when they've actually experienced some form of sexual trauma. For girls, tragically, that they are particularly at risk for sexual assault or abuse. As many as 33 to 50% of them who become involved in the juvenile justice system have experienced sexual trauma. And boys and girls, young men and young women who become involved in the juvenile justice system are highly, highly at risk. At least 50% of them have been traumatically, physically, or sexually assaulted. We know that from studies in the United States that somewhere between 10 to more than 1/4 of youth in the juvenile justice system, 10% to 1/4, have developed post-traumatic stress disorder. So they're not just experiencing post-traumatic stress reactions, which are entirely expectable, but they are experiencing reactions that are causing them significant difficulties with their functioning in their relationships, in their families, with friends, at school, in all walks of their lives. And we know that PTSD is 2 to 8 times more likely to occur to youth who are involved in juvenile justice compared to comparable youth in the community. So it's really a significant problem that doesn't affect every youth in the juvenile justice system, but a large percentage of them. And there are studies internationally that suggest even higher proportions, somewhere between 1/3 to even half of youth in juvenile justice in several international studies have developed PTSD. This is because kids who are involved in juvenile justice often don't have the kinds of protections, the kinds of safety. They may be in families that are doing their very best for them, but they're often living in communities that are fraught with danger or that are fragmented. Sometimes their families also have become very fragmented and affected by violence or victimization. And the range of types of traumatic victimization that can occur in any child's life, but especially those who end up in the difficulties that lead to juvenile justice involvement, are really quite terrible and quite large, as you can see from this list. So this is just a very, very brief list of the kinds of events that can become traumatic for youth from any background, but especially those who are at risk because of the absence of protection or the exposure to violence that occurs in the lives of so many youth who end up in the juvenile justice system. And as Kathy said, that these are youth who most typically have not experienced just one traumatic stressor or even one type, but multiple types. And a nationally representative sample, the National Study of Children Exposed to Violence that David Finkelhor and his colleagues have done, showed that in a sample of over 2,000 children in the United States, ranging from young children through adolescents, and these are children in the community, not in juvenile justice per se, but 22% had 4 or more types of victimization in the past year. That's types of victimization, not incidents. It could be multiple incidents. Another survey that was done, the National Survey of Adolescents, which was done almost 20 years ago, in that sample of over 3,000 teens in the United States, again, from all walks of life, my colleagues and I found that 8% of these youth could be considered poly-victims. They had, on average, 5 to 10 out of 24 possible types of victimization in their lives. So these are youth who have experienced many, many types of threats to themselves, to those who they care about, and to people and the entirety of their community and their families. Poly-victimized children and youth, we know, are at high risk from Dr. Finkelhorst's study and other studies for involvement in delinquency, including involvement in substance abuse, and for problems with depression as well. So these are the kids who, unfortunately, Time magazine described as part of the dropout nation. They're not all dropouts, and many of them are extremely intelligent. Most of them, in fact, are very, very smart, but they are street smart because they've had to learn how to survive. And they've had to use their intelligence just simply to cope and survive. As a result, they often develop delinquent affiliations, sometimes attitudes, sometimes actually acting on those, and then becoming potentially involved in juvenile justice, as well as in potentially dangerous gang affiliations. These are kids who often have difficulties at school. They're often absent, suspended, just simply disengaged, and simply not willing to continue on that path, even though they may have all the abilities necessary. They have something else on their mind, which is simply survival. These are kids who often are focused on sensation seeking, on trying to just make the most of the moment and grasp any opportunity, as well as any way of avoiding dealing with some of the difficulties and challenges and threats that they face most every day of their lives. As a result, not surprisingly, they're often affected by depression, but also by a sense of shame, hopelessness, a view of themselves as fundamentally damaged, sometimes even leading to self-harm or even suicidality and suicide attempts. They're often volatile and enmeshed in relationships. Sometimes they are victimizers as well as being victimized, often in order to protect themselves, not simply to proactively aggress. In fact, in most cases, they are reactively aggressive, not proactively. And they are at high risk for contact with the juvenile justice system for all those reasons. And you can see that this is not just post-traumatic stress disorder, this is complex PTSD. And in the American Psychiatric Association's 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-5, PTSD itself has actually become much more complex and includes a variety of these very, very wide-ranging kinds of behavioral and emotional reactions, which are basically survival reactions. They include aggression, delinquency, delinquent peer affiliations, school problems, as I've mentioned, difficulties with impulsivity. These are the kids who are often oppositional and defiant. They are often withdrawn, or they are very, very selective about their affiliations and very limited in those to whom they'll trust, but at other times very willing to trust those who are actually not trustworthy. They often have experienced not just traumatic assaults or violence, but losses, and have very profound unresolved grief. So they're struggling with depression, suicidality at times, with panic, obsessive compulsions, sexual difficulty, eating problems, sleep problems. Really, it's just an enormous and terrible laundry list of difficulties that these young people are trying to cope with. No wonder they are experiencing difficulties in their pro-social lives. They're actually trying to cope with challenges that for most of us would be entirely overwhelming. And fundamentally, I think to try to make this something that we can wrap our minds around rather than making it so complex that it's just too much to deal with, this really all boils down to chronic survival coping. So these are youth who have basically learned that they're not safe. Even though they may have very good families, they may have very good peer relationships, they may have even adults who are looking out for them, but in many fundamental ways, they don't feel safe and they're not sure that anyone's going to protect them, and so they focus on making sure that they protect themselves and they protect others who they feel they must serve as kind of for whom they must serve as the protectors. Sometimes friends, sometimes younger siblings, classmates, other family members. Fundamentally, they are hypervigilant because they're never sure whom they can trust, and they're never sure what they're going to have to deal with in the next moment. They're also prone to reactive aggression, again, not proactive, not instrumental, not intending to harm for the most part, even though sometimes they say that, but it's fundamentally an attempt to protect even though aggression is being used as a tool for protection. And it may be overt or covert. It's not just girls who are covert or verbally aggressive. Boys can do that as well. And these are youth who essentially are trying to deal with a life where anyone would have good reason to feel a certain degree of hopelessness. The fact that they're still coping, the fact that they're still trying to find a way, a path through their lives, even if they're doing that in ways that lead to serious legal problems, that's a mark of their resilience in the face of a fundamental sense of hopelessness that often looks like indifference. So these are kids who, when you think about the challenges that they face, as well as the challenges that we face as adults trying to provide some kind of trauma-informed services and help for them, these are youth who typically can't stop and think because they have to react. They're able to think, but they just can't afford to stop and think in many cases, or they don't believe that they can. They often can't let go of grudges and resentments because to do so means that you're potentially a victim and vulnerable. They often can't set or stick with goals, although these are often the pro-social goals that we as adults hope they will stick with and that we know that they're capable of, but they actually are very good at sticking with goals as long as they're survival goals. Our challenge is to help them to have the opportunity to actually focus on goals that are not purely about survival, while not denying the fact that they actually do have to face survival threats, even when it appears that they are in a much safer place. These are kids who often can't trust, but who can't tell who is trustworthy, and sometimes they are actually relationally promiscuous, not just sexually, but relationally promiscuous, looking to bond with and trust those who seem most available, even when they are really not, unfortunately, at times entirely trustworthy. And they're often simply too stressed or bored or worn out to be able to think clearly. And in many cases, they're simply too angry to actually remember and know how to use their anger management skills. So, in order to help these youth, we want juvenile justice systems to become trauma-informed. Well, there are two fundamental ways in which this can happen, and we'll talk some more about this throughout the entire webinar. The first is, and I'm borrowing from the pediatric literature here, first is to think about universal precautions. We really need to help these youth and their family members and the adults who work with them, including ourselves and our colleagues, to understand what is it that has changed for these youth and how can they actually survive without always being in survival mode. And that's true for all of us, families, communities, those of us who work in the system, and we also need to be very aware of the fact that families and people working in the system, including ourselves, are affected by the spillover of the traumatic stress that these youths are experiencing. They don't traumatize us for the most part, very rarely, but they are experiencing so much traumatic stress that it affects us indirectly as well. We can end up in survival mode in working with them, and that's something we have to be very careful about. The second concept is beyond universal precautions, which basically mean ways to understand the dilemma and something practical to do about it. We have to provide anticipatory guidance, and that is practical knowledge and skills for how to deal with these kinds of survival threats while still being able to self-regulate. And that's the first challenge that we'll talk about. But before we go on to the potential solutions and the ways to do trauma-informed juvenile justice, we have to be mindful of the fact that there are some downsides potentially. It's possible that when kids are assessed, screened or assessed for traumatic stress difficulties, as Dr. Cruz will talk about in just a moment, it's also possible that this information can lead to a net widening, and it can lead to difficulties in legal cases where prosecutors can actually use this information with the best of intentions, but to protect public safety, but it can be used against the youth. And it can also lead to the kind of net widening that can lead kids to become involved and families to become involved in services that they don't want to be involved in, and where they are required to do things that actually go against their own best interests from their perspective. We have to be very careful that we don't prescribe trauma-informed services as a way of fixing a problem which then actually worsens that problem, whether it comes from net widening, leading to unintended difficulties with legal cases, and it's also costly. This is not something that any system is poised and ready to do without being able to allocate substantial resources. So we have to be thoughtful about ways to make this economical, safe, and beneficial for youth rather than actually inadvertently harming them, and beneficial for the entire public safety mission that we all share. So the bottom line is we need to be thinking about public safety, but we also need to be thinking about public health. And we need to be thinking about education so that everyone can access what I will call their learning brain, and I'll explain that in just a moment. And we need to do this in a way that is economically viable. So what constitutes trauma-informed services for justice-involved youth? Well, the first step in universal precautions is screening, and Dr. Cruz will talk about that very shortly. So I'll just give you a quick highlight. We all know that the MAISY-2 has been widely used, and Dr. Cruz will talk about a potential innovation that can actually enhance that excellent instrument. We also need to provide education and practical skills, and that's where the Trauma Affect Regulation Guide for Education and Therapy model that I've developed with colleagues in the juvenile justice system and in a variety of systems is a good example. Two others that are well worth considering are trauma and grief components therapy for adolescents and cognitive processing therapy for adolescents, both of which have demonstrated some promising results with youth involved in the juvenile justice system. But Target is actually the intervention that has been most widely used in juvenile justice systems, even though it's still just beginning. And we focus in particular in working with staff as well as clinicians in the juvenile justice system on 4 basic steps to self-regulation. And they're actually very simple to say, but these really require a great deal of discipline and a lot of training, preparation, and ongoing consultation to actually embed in a system. So the 4 basic steps that we work on with youth, with staff, with clinicians, with administrators, with prosecutors, with attorneys and judges are, first of all, just simply noticing when you're having what we call an alarm reaction, then recognizing a specific trigger instead of hypervigilantly searching for all possible triggers, then a way of focusing that I will describe to you, and finally, choosing a goal that is based on not just survival, but on core values. Sounds simple, but it takes quite a bit of work. Here's a simple schematic for that, where we show youth and staff and all the folks in the juvenile justice system. It's as simple as 4 steps, and it's also as complicated as 4 steps. We've done some outcome studies, and I will tell you more about those 4 steps in just a moment, but just for those of you who are interested in the evidence base, we've done a study with adults in substance abuse treatment where Target was delivered as a group intervention, and we found that actually sobriety self-efficacy was enhanced by Target over and above very strong and very intensive substance abuse treatment. We've done this with moms who have PTSD and are raising a young child. So these are moms who often have had involvement in child welfare and or juvenile justice earlier in their lives, and now they're continuing on, some of whom were teenage moms and some were young adults. And we found that in comparison to a very strong alternative therapy, present-centered therapy, the Target actually enhanced not only recovery from PTSD, but also emotion regulation, just as we were hoping. We did this again then with girls who were involved in delinquency and the juvenile justice system. That's the 3rd reference. And we delivered both of those studies involved Target delivered as a 10 to 12 session individual therapy. And we found that with girls, compared to a very strong supportive therapy, which the girls loved just as much as the Target therapy, the Target actually was superior in terms of reducing PTSD symptoms, but the supportive therapy, which was very relationally based, was actually superior in terms of reducing anger and depression and increasing self-efficacy. So it's clear that you need a skill or an intervention that not only provides emotion regulation skills, but also that enhances a sense of relational security. And in delivering Target, we actually do both. For that study, we just artificially separated. And then we've done another study where Target was delivered with women in our state prison in Connecticut in a group format, and found that actually those women who received the target group were actually better able to develop a sense of forgiveness for those who had harmed them and others, not because we prescribed that, but because they felt that that was something that they could do once they were able to understand their own reactions. In the juvenile justice system, we've been fortunate to do a couple of studies, one with the Department of Juvenile Justice in Ohio, and there were youth in 2 different units in mental health secure juvenile justice facilities who received target, and several other units that did not receive target. Those that received the target intervention as a group for the youth, as well as a milieu intervention where they were doing this on a day in and day out basis, they had 50% fewer dangerous incidents and 50% less use of seclusion, and no increase in physical disciplinary responses versus the other units that were just doing their usual excellent rehabilitation programs. They actually had 3 to 4 times increases in dangerous incidents and in use of seclusion and physical disciplinary responses. A quick picture, the blue line shows the target units and their use of seclusion, which you can see from the peak right before target was instituted went down and stayed down. And then the other units, unfortunately, their use of seclusion went up quite drastically over the same time period. Whoops, and I'm going to go back. In another study that we were able to do in Connecticut's juvenile justice system in our detention centers, we were able to actually identify almost 400 youth who had been consecutively admitted to detention, and most of these were youth of color. Most were male, but there were 10% who were girls. Many of them had full or partial PTSD, and half of them received target in groups and half received usual services. For every group session that a youth received in their first week in detention, there were 54% fewer dangerous incidents in the next 2 weeks of their stay, if they stayed that long, and they had 72 minutes fewer or less seclusion in their 2-week stay. That's for every session. And most of these youths received somewhere between 2 and 4 sessions of target, even in a very short stay. Recidivism also decreased during the period of time where target was being implemented. So the take-home message here really is, if you go back to a wonderful report, which I would refer all of you to, the Attorney General's Task Force on Children Exposed to Violence, there is a chapter that was written primarily by Robert Listenby, who is now the administrator for the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Programs. And the recommendations there are that these kinds of anticipatory guidance, universal precautions, education and skills for youth as well as for staff to enable them to actually achieve a sense of self-regulation rather than just struggling with constant survival coping. This is exactly what is needed, is called for, and is needed in every juvenile justice system. That begins with screening and assessment. And for that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Cruz. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julian, for that great introduction and the setup for this presentation, which will focus on trauma screening and assessment within the juvenile justice system. So during this part of the overall webinar, I'm going to work to define and distinguish the differences between screening and assessment, and I would like to illustrate current screening practices and reference different types of tools that are available to screen for trauma exposures and trauma reactions. And then finally, I'll provide some examples of some promising screening tools and highlight some system considerations when selecting a trauma screening tool and to try and set up a system of screening and assessment. So systematic screening, both for delinquency, risk needs, and mental health, have become common practices at entry points into the juvenile justice system. And we believe that routine screening, just as Julian was referencing, and routine screening for trauma exposures and trauma symptoms fits very well within the current screening practices and guidelines, and ultimately it's a very critical component in establishing a trauma-informed juvenile justice system. Trauma screening done at system intake can really assist with and inform other elements of a broader trauma-informed perspective. For example, trauma screening can provide information that can help staff partner with families and youth in safety planning and possible prevention of additional exposures to traumatic events that might occur post-screening. Trauma screening can facilitate sharing of relevant information on a youth's current functioning, both within a particular part of the system, like detention or probation, but also across systems. Unfortunately, many of the youth that come into contact with the juvenile justice system are also involved in other aspects of mental health care or are dual system involved, meaning possibly concurrent and or prior histories with the child welfare system. So types of screening and the sharing of that information can really assist with and enhance possibilities for providing a continuity of care. Trauma screening can identify different types of exposures and severity of symptoms that can help juvenile justice staff understand and intervene appropriately when youth are in residential and correctional care settings. What Julian was just referencing is screening and assessment, the extent to which it can identify both the extent and the severity of youth's chronic survival coping, can then assist staff in how to be more responsive to those needs. And ultimately, this will help to create a much more safe environment, both for youth and staff, and to help create an overall trauma-responsive care environment. Finally, screening can help ensure that the exposure histories and the active trauma reactions or active PTSD symptoms are evaluated in a very standardized way. And using standardized decision rules that are based on well-researched screening tools have the possibility of reducing racial and ethnic disparities and access to care. But let's just pause for a minute and let's review what we mean by screening. Screening is a process that is used with every youth, typically at the point of system intake, for example, detention and or probation intake. Screening identifies youth who might have the characteristics in question, such as mental health needs or difficulties, delinquency risk factors, trauma exposures, trauma reactions, just to illustrate. And screening, any good screening will sort youth into one of two categories. First, youth will be screened out. These are going to be youth who are very unlikely to have the behavioral health needs identified in the point above. The second group will be youth that are actually screened in. It's going to usually be a much smaller group that might have the behavioral health needs but would require some sort of further follow-up or a more comprehensive look at the needs that were flagged using the screen. Screening ultimately provides a brief snapshot of the youth's functioning, whether that be their delinquency risk factors or their mental health needs, including trauma reactions. It's not comprehensive, and it doesn't provide information about what is driving the youth's behavior. Assessment, on the other hand, provides follow-up for the youth who were screened in to make decisions about individualized need for intervention and case management planning. It can involve a focus on mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment, trauma-specific treatment, and or delinquency reduction interventions. Now, such assessments are going to be more time-intensive, they're going to require more staff resources, and ultimately can be more expensive for systems to implement. But ultimately, these assessments are used for service delivery and treatment planning, typically post-disposition or, for example, like a post-diversion decision or after placement into a custody setting. And they're going to involve a much more comprehensive review and prioritization of treatment needs, as well as identifying the interventions that are matched to those priority treatment needs. And to truly achieve a trauma-informed juvenile justice system, we need a combination of trauma screening and the ability to follow up on youth who are screened in for a more comprehensive trauma assessment. And what this table illustrates is that trauma screening practices are really consistent with that basic definition of screening that I just reviewed. First of all, it's universal. In other words, trauma screening can be administered to all youth at a point of contact with the system. Screens need to be cost-effective, that they're brief, and they don't create an excessive burden on the system to implement. Screenings are primarily descriptive in nature. They're typically capturing information that is self-reported by youth regarding their recent functioning. Screenings also typically need to be able to be conducted by non-clinicians and, like I mentioned before, implemented at the point of a system contact. And ultimately, referencing those two screening decision points, they're used to determine what youth are in need of referral for further assessment in terms of that screening in and screening out process. Now, a follow-up trauma assessment targets the systematic review of both the numbers and the types of prior traumatic event exposures that a youth has experienced, and then evaluates in an in-depth way the presence and the severity of current trauma symptoms. Comprehensive in nature, drawing on multiple sources of information that could include the youth, a primary caregiver, collateral respondents in terms of prior mental health providers, for example, or other juvenile justice personnel who are familiar with and or know the youth. And it's also going to involve a focus on the use of collateral records to both augment and inform that assessment. It typically addresses, and this is the most important thing, it typically addresses the onset, the duration, and the severity of trauma event exposures and the presence of active trauma symptoms. And then, of course, evaluates the linkage of these difficulties with other emotional and behavioral problems that could include many things from that laundry list of the difficulties that Julian just mentioned, such things as aggression, depression, substance use, just to name a few of those examples. A good trauma assessment, of course, can lead to a diagnosis, but ultimately is going to require a referral. Hopefully that's informed by the screening process that I just reviewed. And the outcome of this assessment is going to be an individualized case conceptualization that describes to what extent the trauma exposures and reactions are impacting the youth and how this needs to be taken into account and prioritized in the development of a more comprehensive case plan. So, how do we develop a good trauma screening practice? Well, in general, what we know is that any good screening practice is more than just administering a tool. A good screening practice is based on a tool that's designed for use with adolescents and or youth within the juvenile justice system. Good screening practice is one where it's selecting a tool where the tool has enough research evidence that supports its reliability and validity of the different types of scores and or the decision rules that are generated by that screen. Screens should be administered and scored based on standardized procedures to support uniformity in the system's response. And it should be conducted at intake or initial point of system contact with, of course, the options to re-administer the screen based upon any changes in the use functioning and or changes in terms of gates of entry. And finally, good screening practice is supported by policies that facilitate the standardized administration, the communication about the results, and can protect the confidentiality of the results from misuse. And for agencies considering any type of screening practice, the third and the fifth points, I believe, are very critical. Standardized procedures require training of staff, typically non-clinical staff, and how to introduce, explain, and actually conduct the screening. Even tools with excellent psychometric properties in terms of their reliability and validity can have very limited practical utility if youth taking the screen are not informed, one, why they're being asked to complete the screening, number two, who will see the results of the screen, and three, how that information from the screen will be used. Very critical, as Julian mentioned, to make sure to avoid the net widening effect that can occur, is to make sure that any screening procedures, including trauma screening, really adhere to these standardized procedures and that are supported by these types of policies to not only facilitate communication but also to protect the confidentiality of the results. These points are critical as a way to minimize the likelihood of that net widening effect. So why should we screen for trauma? Well, as Julian has just referenced, Both the number and the types of potential traumatic event exposures have very important implications for both the behavioral and the mental health needs of youth in the juvenile justice system. And many people, I'm sure, on the webinar are familiar with the MAISY-2, which is the most common mental health screen that is utilized within the juvenile justice systems across the United States. We know that there are some limitations in relying on any broad screen, but also in relying on a specific scale from the MAISY, which is known as the Traumatic Experiences Scale, in trying to identify youth at risk for PTSD. And just to illustrate this point very quickly, research conducted by one of our colleagues, Patricia Carrig, and her colleagues sought to identify a possible cut score on the MAISY-2 TE scale in identifying detained youth who met either partial or full PTSD criteria. A cut score of 2, in other words, endorsement of 2 items out of 5 on the traumatic experiences scale, correctly screened in or correctly identified about 70% of detained males and females with about a 30% false positive rate. Now, these are basic utility or identification rates that are comparable to the other MAISY-2 scales. But interestingly, other MAISY-2 scales, including the Angry Irritable Scale and the Depressed Anxious Scale, worked just as well as a cut score of 2 on the TE scale. Now, systems typically use warning scores on the MAISY-2 to identify youth for follow-up. And traditional warning scores in this study from the Angry Irritable subscale and the Depressed Anxious scale missed many youth who were identified with either partial or full PTSD. Now, these results suggest that it's quite possible that a combination of scale elevations from the MAISY may be required to adequately screen in or identify youth who are in need of a further trauma assessment. Unfortunately, the current research studies with the MAISY have not yet provided very clear guidance to the broader field on whether this kind of configural or multiple scale approach to interpreting the MAISY will work better in identifying youth with active PTSD symptoms, or to screen in youth who are in need of a further trauma assessment. Now, however, screening is not necessarily just the endpoint. Screening does not always translate into appropriate service delivery. Linda Teplin and her colleagues, in terms of the Northwestern Juvenile Justice Project, have reported that the vast majority of youth, even when they are identified with mental health needs, and those included in this study, trauma-exposed youth and youth with PTSD, don't often receive a community-based services. And as Julian just mentioned, providing youth with trauma-specific services can help reduce that chronic survival coping through more adaptive self-regulation. And we view ultimately screening and then utilizing that information to further assess and link youth into appropriate services is really a critical first step. We've got to start with identifying youth who are in need for that further assessment and then targeting those youth for the particular types of interventions that Julian just mentioned. So I want to further just break down trauma screening into not only the decision steps, but also some dimensions that might result from the screens as well. We've already reviewed the decision steps from the screen. That involves that process of sorting youth into a screened in and a screened out group. But we also want to consider what type of information is collected via a trauma screen. Available screens will focus really on 3 different dimensions along the trauma continuum: a history of exposure to potential traumatic events, current PTSD symptoms, and whether youth is likely to meet more formal diagnostic criteria for PTSD. And what I've been providing here is just a list of different types of trauma exposure screens. I'll illustrate a few of these without going through all of them in detail. The Adverse Child Experiences Scale, or what's known as the ACEs scale, provides coverage of 10 adversity categories, including things like maltreatment, assault, parental mental health, and substance abuse difficulty. The Traumatic Events Screening Inventory for children covers 24 different adverse and potentially traumatic events, with more detailed information provided, for example, on things like the age of onset, and with different versions that are available for a youth informant and also a parent informant version. The Juvenile Victimization Questionnaire, or the JVQ, covers 32 items that cover a full range of interpersonal victimization experiences. It's commonly used in community studies and has been very influential on the field in helping to establish various criteria or cut points of establishing use patterns of poly-victimization. We've got 2 additional measures that will provide information on current post-traumatic symptoms in addition to lifetime trauma exposures. UCLA PTSD Reaction Index for children and adolescents for the DSM-5 is one example. It's divided into separate parts that cover lifetime exposures and presence and severity of PTSD symptoms that a youth has endorsed as occurring over the past month. The Structured Trauma-Related Experiences and Symptom Screener, or the STRESS, is a tool that is available in either paper or pencil version or a computer-facilitated format. It covers 24 different exposures to lifetime adverse events or potential traumatic experiences and establishes both the presence and severity of PTSD symptoms endorsed by a youth during the past week. It also provides some minimal screening information around dissociative symptoms and provides us some useful information around functional impairment that's associated with these symptoms in a youth's relationship with their peers, in their homes, and also in school. Now, there's some really important caveats that warrant mentioning around all of these measures that I just reviewed quickly. With few exceptions, there's limited data regarding the psychometric properties, in other words, the reliability and the validity of the tools with justice-involved youth. And as Julian mentioned, event exposures are actually very, very common in the lives of youth that come into contact with the juvenile justice system and cover a wide range of event types, including exposures witnessing and experiencing family violence, witnessing and experiencing community violence, sexual abuse, and also traumatic loss, losing a close friend, losing a close family member through some traumatic means. And what's very critical for systems to think about is that brief, i.e. short, event exposure screens will end up, we believe, having very limited utility because they don't cover the range of events that are typically experienced by justice-involved youth. There are also probable limitations in simply focusing on lifetime event exposures. That could result in many, many youth being screened in instead of a good trauma event screen will take into account not only just if a youth is exposed, yes or no, but can count on the number and the types of events that a youth has experienced, and then does that broader linkage into both the presence and or absence of particular patterns of recent experiences of symptoms of PTSD. Now, in other words, just because screen is in the name of the tool doesn't mean that there is relevant research and or existing and established decision rules that will support the use of the tool as a screen, as I've just identified. More often than not, tools such as the UCLA PTSD Index are oftentimes used as a brief assessment for PTSD. And as a screen, the feasibility of their administration by non-clinical staff hasn't really been adequately tested. And for many of the tools, we do not yet have structured cut scores or decision points that address which youth should be screened in for a more full or comprehensive assessment, and which youth we would feel comfortable about screening out from that further assessment process. Now, even though that sounds a little pessimistic, there's promising research projects that are being actively conducted with many of the tools that I just reviewed that hopefully within a short time frame will be able to establish and provide for the field some psychometrically or empirically supported cut scores that systems can then utilize as they're thinking about setting up their screening and assessment processes. Ultimately, the take-home point here, though, in terms of considerations is that we believe that some review of exposures plus a review of active PTSD symptoms are going to be more beneficial in order to establish a trauma-informed screening and assessment process. And to wrap up this section of the presentation, rather than having direct answers to all of these questions for everyone on the webinar, I would like to offer some questions that systems can consider when they're thinking about implementing trauma screens in the juvenile justice setting. First, we have to think about what is the goal of the screening. Systems really need to focus on identifying their goals or what they expect to achieve from the screen, and this should be informed by considering the 3 trauma screening dimensions that I identified. Is it important for the system to focus on exposures only? Is it important for the system to identify the extent to which a youth is currently experiencing some active trauma reactions or PTSD symptoms that might necessitate some further assessment and or link with intervention? And then it may be very important for the youth to, for the system to identify and appropriately identify those youth who are most likely to be at a meeting symptoms that would meet or surpass the symptoms required to be diagnosed with PTSD. Second question is, what is the system's readiness to implement a screen? This comes back to basic questions around what staff persons will be responsible for administering the screen, what level of training will be required, and what ongoing levels of support and or supervision might be necessitated and be available to those staff once the screens are implemented. Third question is, who will see the screening and how will that information be utilized? As I mentioned before, and this is just to reiterate that point, communication and confidentiality are key. Do the current screening policies that are available in most juvenile justice settings regarding mental health screening, does it adequately address who will see the screening results and how this information will be used? Very critical for those policies to be re-examined with an eye towards the types of information about trauma exposures and trauma reactions that could be revealed through the use of a screening procedure. Fourth question is, what capacities are available for post-screening clinical consultation? It's very critical for systems to identify their post-screening resources. Systems must consider their current capacity for post-screening follow-up, both from an emergent and a crisis management perspective, but also as part of a broader clinical consultation process. And eventually then, systems need to consider what resources are available for that more comprehensive trauma assessment that I described earlier. This will typically involve some user development of in-house resources to provide a type of more comprehensive trauma assessment, or referrals to providers within other systems of care or within the community at large. Ultimately, this, of course, requires some attention and level of detail, not only to the qualifications of those providers to be conducting these types of assessments, but oftentimes is going to involve really thinking through a level of community-based collaboration. And with that, I'd like to turn the webinar over to Chris Branson.
All right. Thank you, Keith. And it's my pleasure to be here, and I appreciate everyone who's taken the time out to join us today. My name is Christopher Branson, and today I'll be talking about workforce development. In other words, how do we make sure that all key frontline staff in the juvenile justice system have sufficient knowledge and training in trauma-informed practices? And so here's an overview of what I'll be talking about today. I'll be providing a rationale for why we want to focus on workforce development, some of the areas we want to focus on when training staff, available models to train staff in, and then I'll end with some tips and potential barriers for putting this into practice. And if we have time, I'll tell you a little bit about the work that we're doing here in New York City to make our system trauma-informed. So before I get into the rationale for workforce development or staff training, I want to briefly review what it means for a system to be trauma-informed. So some of you may have seen a report released by SAMHSA in late 2014, which lays out their definition of a trauma-informed system. And if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. And in this report, they list the 4 R's for what makes a system trauma-informed. And I think this gives a nice broad framework, for thinking about how to bring trauma-informed care to your system. So the first R is trauma-informed system realizes the impact of trauma on clients and staff. The second one is recognizes the signs of trauma. And so this goes beyond just screening, as Keith just talked about, but to include just signs that, youth may be suffering from trauma, may need to be referred to screening in the first place, or may be having a trauma reaction right in front of you. The third R is responds to client, staff, and trauma. And the fourth one is resists re-traumatizing youth involved in the system, which I'll explain a little bit more in a minute. So why should we focus on workforce development? Well, to achieve those 4 R's that I just laid out, we want all frontline professionals to have training to recognize the signs of trauma and to be able to respond effectively to youth and families with histories of trauma exposure. It's great to send kids to trauma treatment, but if the therapist is the only person in the system who really understands trauma, then it's really going to have a minimal impact. And the reason is kids in the justice system come into contact with a lot of adults who have decision-making power in their lives, including judges, attorneys, probation officers, case managers. And if these folks don't understand trauma, they may misinterpret youth behavior, as signs of, aggression, defiance, disrespect, and they may fail to realize that a kid's in need of trauma-informed treatment and may end up referring them to services that aren't really going to help. Also, a key principle of a trauma-informed system is physical and psychological safety. When trauma survivors feel unsafe, as Julian described earlier, they respond in ways that are designed to keep them safe. But unfortunately, a lot of time these reactions can cause them more legal problems. So let me give you just a quick example. I had a client who had recently lost a best friend to murder. And as a result, he had stopped going to school out of fear for his safety. And so the judge in this case viewed this youth's behavior as noncompliance, was threatening to incarcerate the youth. And I ended up writing a letter on the kid's behalf to explain that the reason the youth was avoiding school was for fear of his safety, and that this was a completely normative reaction to trauma, and that locking this youth up was likely to make his symptoms even worse. And as a result, the judge thankfully was willing to allow the kid to remain in the community so he could continue attending treatment. And none of this would have happened if the client's case manager hadn't advocated for it and the judge didn't have an understanding of trauma. And, there's a growing recognition that the justice system often engages in practices that can be coercive or punitive, that can make kids feel unsafe and cause them to have these unhelpful reactions or even re-traumatize them. And, as I mentioned, these reactions can cause them more legal problems and make it harder for them to rehabilitate and get out of the system, which is really the major goals of the justice system. Some examples of these punitive practices include, separating youth from their parents to place them in corrections, using physical restraint and isolation in correctional settings, threatening youth with harsh sanctions, placing them in violent detention correctional settings where they could be re-victimized, and also just failing to provide youth and families with a voice or choice in the services that are mandated. So for all of these reasons, we really want all professionals within the system to have a shared language for discussing and understanding youth behavior. So now the question becomes, what type of training do we provide? What should we be focusing on when we train staff? So the first area is knowledge. We want staff of all levels to have knowledge about how trauma affects normal adolescent development and how it can contribute to delinquency and involvement in the justice system. We also want to educate professionals about trauma triggers or reminders. These are things that remind youth of past traumatic experiences, or make them otherwise feel unsafe, including interactions with juvenile justice staff or some of the coercive practices that I just mentioned. And we also want staff to be able to recognize the early warning signs that a youth is having a trauma reaction so that they can intervene. Now, the second area is skills. You know, it's essential that we provide staff with specific skills for intervening with trauma survivors. It's really not useful for a probation officer or correctional officer to say, hey, that kid is definitely having a trauma reaction. You know, I have no idea what to do about it, but that's definitely a trauma reaction. We have to give them skills so that they can respond, help de-escalate, help kids feel safe. And without these new skills, staff will fall back on the tried and true strategies, which, as I mentioned, are often coercive or overly punitive and can unintentionally make things worse. So that second major area is skills for working with trauma survivors. Some specific examples, and it's really going to depend on the role of the staff, can include safety plans or crisis plans, so knowing a youth's triggers, the early warning signs, and what does or does not help them cope or calm down. Also specific skills for de-escalating youth, and skills for building rapport, trust, and engagement. A third area is staff secondary trauma, and I really want to highlight this one. If you're not familiar with the term, secondary trauma refers to the idea that just by working with trauma survivors, we can be negatively impacted by hearing their trauma stories, seeing their negative reactions to trauma, and in some settings, maybe being threatened or directly assaulted by staff who are by youth who are in the midst of a trauma reaction. And research shows that staff across juvenile justice, this includes law enforcement, judges, attorneys, probation officers, case managers, therapists, across all of those groups, there are high levels of vicarious trauma, which can lead to negative health issues, mental health problems, burnout, and turnover. And if you have high turnover in your agency, it's going to be really hard to sustain any kind of trauma-informed practices you're trying to put into place. And in all the consulting that I do with juvenile justice agencies, I've found that almost all agencies lack strong policies or services designed to support staff and prevent secondary or vicarious trauma. Many staff have told me they've been suffering with symptoms of this for decades and no one's ever asked them about it. So this is something that has to change if we really want our system to be trauma-informed. We have to take care of the helpers if we want them to be able to help really take care of the kids in the system. So next, I want to talk a little bit about some of the available models that you can use to train staff within your systems. So I should mention that, you know, the push for trauma-informed justice systems is a fairly new trend, so there's a limited number of training models out there. And so I'm going to highlight some of the most well-known and widely used ones. The first one is Think Trauma, which was developed by my colleagues within the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And it's a 16-hour training that can be used with a broad range of juvenile justice professionals. And it provides a strong foundation and knowledge, understanding of child trauma, as well as some basic skills. And that one's available on the NCTSN website, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. It's free to download and for you to use and adapt as you see fit. A second one, which I won't go into too much since Julian mentioned it earlier, is Target 4-Step or the T4 model, which gives specific skills that frontline staff can use to engage, de-escalate youth and help them cope when they're having trauma reactions. And it's a model we're actually using, Think Trauma and T4 in New York City. I'll tell you a little bit more about that as well. A few others that I just want to highlight briefly. In Maine, they have a initiative to create trauma-informed systems, and they provide technical assistance and training using a model that they've developed, and you can find more information on their website. Another model is STARE, which is specific skills, again, that can be used by frontline staff similar to T4, and I have colleagues that are using that here in New York City in some of our detention centers. The last two models I want to highlight are Sanctuary and ARC, which are really about creating a trauma-informed milieu or work environment. So it includes skills, but also just creating a sense of safety for staff, for youth, you know, and so they're, you know, it's more than just a simple training. It's really kind of like a organizational culture change. So, you know, these are some of the most widely available models, you know, and ones that have been used most in juvenile justice. So next, you know, I want to share some of the lessons learned from my own experience consulting with justice systems on trauma-informed change. And so my first recommendation is to train everyone, and by that I really mean everyone, from administrators to, you know, supervisors, frontline staff, down to the front desk staff. Anyone who's interacting with youth needs to have these skills and needs to have this understanding of behavior. You know, I've been in agencies where, you know, if the frontline staff, the front desk staff are not trauma-informed, they can trigger a youth and, you know, have them pretty worked up before they even meet with their probation officer and case manager. And in that situation, it's going to be much harder, you know, to get accomplished what you want to. So it really is important that all staff throughout the system and agencies that have contact with youth have some understanding and some level of skill for working with trauma survivors. But you really need to make sure that you tailor the training both by the type of agency and by the type of staff. So for example, correctional officers are going to need much different skills than a judge or an attorney. Similarly, diversion programs have much different cultures, staffing, and issues in a correctional facility or a courthouse. To give you an example, a correction facility may be focused on using trauma-informed strategies to manage behavior in an effort to cut down on use of harsher strategies like seclusion or physical restraint. In contrast, a probation officer may focus on using rapport-building skills so they can engage youth in discussions about non-compliance rather than just threatening sanctions to try to get kids to do what they need to do for court. Attorneys may need training on how to prepare youth for court, knowing when and how to advocate for trauma-informed services, and also just making kids feel safe so that they feel able to participate actively in their court hearing and not just shut down out of fear. Correctional officers, I mentioned, may need skills in de-escalating youth. Probation officers, case managers may need skills in building rapport, gaining youth trust, and possibly even conducting trauma screens. A third issue to consider in workforce development is how to promote staff learning and use of trauma-informed practices over time. A single workshop is not going to be sufficient. You know, staff need some kind of ongoing support, whether it's consultation calls or supervision or booster sessions, because it really does take time to change staff practice. So it's really important that you think through what kind of support is going to be needed to change the way that staff interact with youth. Another issue is thinking about how will you actually know if staff are using these practices. You know, you can't just ask them, but to think about how are you going to measure this? How are you going to make sure that staff are actually putting these practices into use and using them effectively and getting the desired outcomes? You know, a fourth issue is to gain staff buy-in. So, you know, while a lot of us are strong believers in trauma-informed practice, staff may be resistant to trauma-informed care for a lot of reasons. You know, we throw a lot of new initiatives at staff, and I've heard the phrase over and over, you know, the flavor of the month. This is just the new thing that will be gone and, you know, by next year. Also, some staff may feel that it's soft on crime. It lets kids get away with bad behavior, which is really not the case. But if folks don't have a clear understanding of what trauma-informed means, they may be resistant from the get-go. And also, for more veteran staff, they may have more faith in their own judgment or their own tried-and-true skills. So it may take some work to show them the potential benefit of giving trauma-informed practices a try. And the other area is thinking about new policies that you might need to put in place to support the creation of trauma-informed agencies and systems. And I'll give some examples of those in a minute. So you really need to think through how you're going to roll this out, how to convey to staff throughout your agency or your system that this is a priority. And how you roll it out is just as important as what model or skills you roll out. You can't just send an email blast. It's really going to take an active effort to try to engage and get buy-in and get feedback from staff. Now, there are also some challenges, other challenges you need to think about, particularly the cost. You know, some of these models that I mentioned are free, but others could be quite expensive. And so you may need to secure external funding or maybe change policies to allocate funding to be able to provide staff training. I also recommend, you know, if you don't have a local trauma expert that you're connected with, that you can consult with, then to try to find one that can help you implement some of these models. And the website for the National Child Traumatic Stress Network lists members of our network by state. And so I highly recommend that as a place to go to find local trauma experts in your area if you don't already know one. All right, so to make this a little less abstract, I'm going to illustrate what trauma-informed care looks like by talking about what we're doing here in New York City. So we have a 4-year grant from SAMHSA, which is part of the federal government, and we're working with 5 different agencies to make them trauma-informed. So we're working with our Department of Probation, a big correctional facility, a drug treatment court, and 2 alternatives to incarceration programs, or diversion programs. And we're rolling out trauma-informed change and practices in multiple phases. So the first phase was providing training for all staff using Think Trauma, the curriculum that I mentioned earlier. And the goal was to make sure that we get buy-in from all staff and ensure that staff have a common language, shared understanding of trauma and its impact on youth. Next, we provided training for frontline staff using Julian Ford's T4 model, you know, to give staff skills for engaging youth, de-escalating, and just, you know, helping them interact with youth more effectively, which we hope will help the youth feel more safe in the agency. And if they feel more safe, they're more likely to be engaged in the services, to follow through with court mandates, and also to open up about what's really going on with them and maybe getting in the way of them, you know, sticking to their court mandates. We're also providing training to staff in the intake department on conducting trauma screening and assessment so that they're able to identify those youth who are really suffering from traumatic stress and in need of trauma-informed services. And then we're training the clinical staff to provide trauma-informed group therapy using the target model, which was developed also by Julian Ford. Now, a couple things I want to highlight. So in all this staff training, we're using a train-the-trainer model. And what that means is we're taking a small group of staff from different disciplines and really intensively training them in these different practices so that they can become internal experts for their agency. And that way, they can help their agency sustain these practices over time. You know, if you have to keep coming up with funding, you know, every time you have staff turnover and you have to train new staff, it's going to be really hard to sustain these practices over time. So our hope is by helping agencies develop this internal expertise that it's really going to help them keep these practices in place for a long time. Another important piece of our work is working with the leaders not only on addressing barriers to putting these practices into place, but also thinking about changes to organizational policies or procedures that will help make their agencies more trauma-informed and support the use of trauma-informed practices. So for example, reducing or replacing harsh disciplinary strategies. So in the Department of Probation, one of their goals is to cut down on probation violations for defiant or disrespectful behavior by clients. And so we're really working to help them think about ways to make that happen systematically beyond just providing staff with training in trauma-informed practices, but also to put in place policies that convey that this is something that they actively want to change. Another key area is putting in place policies or supports to help prevent staff secondary or vicarious trauma. So a lot of the agencies, as I mentioned earlier, they don't have a lot of resources in place to address staff secondary trauma. Many agencies don't even talk about or aren't even aware of this being an issue. So for example, in a correctional facility we're working with, if correctional officers are assaulted by a youth, or there's a violent incident, a riot, which actually happened recently when I was in the correctional facility, there's no debriefing afterwards. There's no checking in to see how staff have been affected, to see if maybe they need some extra support, some counseling. Really, there's just filling out an incident report and then going back to your daily duties. And so, as I mentioned, if we don't address secondary trauma, it's going to lead to staff turnover. It's going to lead to a more negative, more unsafe environment for youth and staff, and it's really going to prevent us from creating trauma-informed organizations and systems. So it's essential that we work with these agencies, so that they start addressing staff secondary trauma and supervision and team meetings and making available counseling, employee assistance programs, and other resources to help those staff who are being affected by secondary trauma. Now, if that wasn't enough, after all of this, our next steps are to really focus on the courts, so the judges, the prosecutors, and the defense attorneys, to really increase their understanding of child trauma. And so the National Child Traumatic Stress Network has some great resources along these lines that we're going to be using, and they're freely available for you to use as well. The first one I want to highlight is the Judge's Bench Card, which is a one-page, two-sided, quick kind of tip sheet, an informational sheet about child trauma that can help judges, if they're seeing a kid in front of them and suspect that they may have trauma. It gives really practical advice on what they can do in those situations. And also, now within the network, I have the pleasure of being a part of a group that's putting together a similar resource for attorneys. And so we're collaborating with the American Bar Association and the National Juvenile Defender Center to create something similar to the bench cards, but for attorneys. So how they can be trauma-informed legal advocates and work effectively with clients and youth that have histories of trauma. All right. And so the last thing I'd like to do is just give a couple examples of what trauma-informed practice can look like and the potential benefits. So the first scenario I'd like to present is a probation officer discussing youth noncompliance with court mandates, specifically school attendance. So a probation officer that hasn't been trained in child trauma, doesn't have understanding of child trauma, they may start by getting on the youth about missing school, cracking down on them. Hey, you need to do this. If you keep this up, the judge, I'm going to have to violate you, and the judge is going to lock you up. Saying something like that, there's a good chance that's going to make a kid with a trauma history feel unsafe. And so the youth might get upset and get increasingly agitated. And when that happens, the probation officer understandably might get nervous and feel like they need to try to, reestablish control over the situation, which in doing that just escalates the youth further, leading them to storm out of the office, and just not a good outcome for anyone involved. Now, if the probation officer is trained in trauma and they see the youth getting agitated as they discuss the school attendance, the officer might take a step back and realize this youth is feeling unsafe for some reason. I need to switch my approach. And I've actually had this example where a probation officer makes an observation to the youth. I notice you get upset whenever we start discussing school. What's going on? And in the example I'm talking about, the youth actually opened up that school was a big trigger for him because whenever he went, he was so far behind that he just felt hopeless. And because he'd missed so much school and he had a bad reputation, the teachers didn't want to help him, which just made him angry and made him just leave school altogether. So as you see, in that case, just knowing about trauma, making a slight switch in how the probation officer approaches the youth can have a huge difference in the outcome. Second scenario would be a judge and a prosecutor trying to engage a youth in a discussion about noncompliance. So without trauma training, you know, they may start getting on the youth again about the noncompliance, and the kid may feel unsafe. And a lot of kids, when they feel unsafe, they either lash out or they learn to just numb, not feel anything, because that feels safer than feeling terrified or feeling angry. And if a kid's sitting in front of a judge and prosecutor and just refuses to talk or lashes out angrily, they may think, you know, this kid's really antisocial, emotionless, maybe even a psychopath, or may think they're just really not interested in their case or just disrespectful, and that may lead them to give a harsher sanction. Now, if the judge and prosecutor have knowledge of trauma, they may recognize this kid's having a trauma reaction. And instead of reacting angrily to the kid's silence, maybe they soften up their stance. They try to avoid harsh tones or glares that could trigger the kid. This, in turn, makes the kid feel safer and allows them to open up about ongoing stresses in their lives that's making it harder for them to comply with their court mandates. And so the judge, prosecutor, and the youth end up having a productive, collaborative discussion and giving the kid another chance to get back on track rather than incarcerating them. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip the third scenario, but I just want to point out, you know, these are small changes, you know, but can have a huge impact on outcomes and lives of the youth who are involved in the system. And so I'd like to wrap up with some closing thoughts. You know, trauma-informed care is definitely coming to the justice system. It's the Department of Justice is calling for it, the American Bar Association, National Council of Juvenile Family Court and Judges. Basically, every major stakeholder group out there is calling for trauma-informed care right now. So this is a major movement happening not just in New York City, but across the country. And hopefully I've convinced y'all that trauma-informed care offers benefits for all stakeholders. So not just for the youth and families, but also for professionals throughout the system. And it also offers potential benefits for the larger community versus reduced recidivism and reduced spending, because we spend a lot of money to lock kids up and we don't get much bang for our buck. And research has shown when we give kids trauma-informed care, it cuts down on system spending. And the last thing I want to highlight again is this really needs to be a system-wide approach. The system is only as trauma-informed as its weakest link. And so we need everyone, every agency, every discipline throughout the system to be trauma-informed. Thanks very much for your time.
Well, thank you, Chris. And thanks to all of our presenters. That was just a wonderful webinar, jam-packed full of great information. We have just a couple of minutes for questions, and we did actually get a few questions in that I want to pose to all three of the panelists, and you're all unmuted, so you would be able, anybody can jump in at this point to respond, but we only have about a minute or two. So here's the first question that came in. For youth who have had traumatic histories, wouldn't they all have PTSD? Anybody want to take that?
The short answer to that, Kathy, this is Julia, is that most, if not all, will have significant post-traumatic stress difficulties and probably will show some of the signs of survival coping that we talked about earlier. They may not qualify for a technical diagnosis of PTSD, but that also is often very difficult to determine because youth are going to be very, very good and very cautious about letting adults know about some of the symptoms and difficulties that they're experiencing. So I think we need to be careful in not assuming that you have to have, a youth has to have PTSD very clearly in order to actually benefit trauma-informed services.
And this is Chris, and the thing I would add is, you know, also some kids are resilient, and not everyone who experiences trauma is going to have trauma-related difficulties, although we know a lot in the system do.
Thank you both for those responses. There was another question that I'm hoping might be quickly answered, asking whether or not there was any literature, and this came up, Julian, during your presentation, about the concept of hopelessness being masked as indifference. Are you aware of any research that documents that?
That's a really good question, and actually I would refer everyone to the work that actually Keith mentioned. Dr. Patricia Carrig, one of our colleagues, has done some very important research showing that what often looks like callous and unemotional kinds of attitudes, which can also look a great deal like hopelessness, and it often is treated as a criminogenic problem for youth, that this can actually often be emotional numbing that is very specific to post-traumatic stress. So I would refer everyone to Patricia Carrig's work. That's K-E-R-I-G. She's done some wonderful studies with youth and juvenile justice system on a very similar issue.
Great, thank you.
Kathy, this is Keith. I would also add that more broadly, in addition to Patricia's great work that very specifically focuses on aspects of betrayal and related to hopelessness, work done by Eva Kimonis, that's K-I-M-O-N-I-S, has also established and linked that youth that experience a high level of reactive aggression and also show presence of callous and unemotional traits, which can be exhibited as that kind of numbed out and distant reaction from youth. Youth that show those combinations have very, very high levels of exposures to prior traumatic events, including extensive histories of both physical and sexual victimization. So these may be youth that we are linking and seeing that might meet that classification of poly-victimization and possibly even be exhibiting patterns of complex trauma reactions.
Thank you, Keith. So we're just about out of time at this point, and I just want to go over a couple of closing things before we all say goodbye. We got a number of questions about this during the webinar. We will be posting the audio recording and the PowerPoint slides on the CFC website. The web address is listed on the slide that's displaying right now, and we hope to have that up within the next 2 to 3 days. The other thing I want to mention is that we're working on some new content on trauma and the juvenile justice system that Julian Ford has helped us put together, and all of the screening and assessment instruments and training resources that were mentioned in today's PowerPoint presentation will be included in this new resource package that we hope to be posting in the next week. And so if there was anything that anyone heard anything about over the course of the webinar that they want to get more information on, that will be available in our new trauma package that we hope to get up very shortly. So I'd like to thank our amazing presenters. Thank you all so much for taking time to join us today. Thank you to the 400 participants that joined us in cyberspace. We're glad that there were no technical problems. We appreciate your support and hope everyone has a lovely afternoon. Thank you.